Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome, I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a writer always, but sometimes she's a filmmaker, information designer, and content strategist. She holds an M.A. in media theory, history, and criticism from the University of Arizona and an M.F.A. in film and media production from NYU's Graduate Institute of Film and Television. Currently, she's a senior writer for Apple. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Victoria Garza.
Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're celebrating your book publishing this month. For those of us listening later, she published on November 15th, 2022. So, Victoria, our opening question is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
This is a wonderful question. For those who are publishing for the first time later in their life, I have found that it tends to be primarily because there's a lot of other things going on, whatever you call those things, right? For me, I think when I originally started this book, I didn't know that it was a book. So, and when I started the project of writing, or when I started the concept of writing around this material, it was probably a little bit after 9/11. I was still living in New York. And so that was an inciting incident that just got me writing about grief, about loss. And that tragedy was so enormous and it touched so many that just trickled into my own personal loss. And so from there, I started writing, and I would write in huge pockets of time. But also because I was writing and making my living as a writer, the idea of publishing the book was not my number one goal. And so years go by, and then I have a few author friends who looked at my manuscript and looked at everything that I'd written and said, Victoria, you have a book here, right? So I was like, really? You think so? So that's kind of how it started. And then it really, in earnest, when I realized, oh, I actually have a story, and I should probably give it the time it deserves. And so in between everything else and getting married and having a couple of kids and doing all of those other things that us grown-ups do, in the last 5 years, I would say I really finalized and completed it.
Well, your book examines grief and recovery from your own tragedy in your life. Can you tell us more about the inspiration for your memoir?
Sure. The memoir itself is about the story of losing my sister when I was young. So I was about 10 years old. She was 9 years old, and her and my cousin and myself were on our way to an ordinary pajama party in the spring of May of 1978. So one of the threads of the book is really around grief and around the anecdotal story of what it means for a child to experience grief. So one of the peculiar experiences I had as an adult in my older years was now to be able to look back on that and be a completely different person and be able to look upon those incidents and gravitate towards what it actually felt like as a very young person. So that was a wonderful experience to be able to get back into who I was and have enough distance that allowed me to be able to look at that in a very interesting and insightful way. But there's other threads in the book. So it's a very nonlinear, it's seemingly free associative. And I meld between the anecdotal nature of those stories of being a child versus the losses that I'm experiencing as a young adult. And then I also am very intrigued by the contemplative nature that other authors have kind of examined about grief and about loss. So I really pull that in as well. It has a very strong spiritual thread around how everyone in every culture might make sense of something like that. And then those threads are kind of interwoven together. And I would say the final is my decision to incorporate the thoughts of my family. So there were several people who were directly involved in the accident. And then, of course, the parents who were not there, my grandparent, who all experienced that day very differently. And it was all that was the same event. And it happened to the same family. What they were thinking on those days and in those moments, I was able to interview them and then pull a slightly documentary nature to the book, and those are called memorias, and they're very small little interspersed chapters, but those all weave together and they form this kind of non-chronological narrative.
That's very intriguing. And I think certainly by the time we reach over 50, that we have such hindsight and such different perspectives. When I talk to my own children, they're 3 children who grew up in the same house. They have such different perspectives about every single memory.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, you get that now, but now that I have kids, it's really interesting to look and when you have children, to be able to look back upon your youth, you look back upon it differently. And that's definitely true now. I see things, and kids are, of course, very ever-present creatures, and it's a wonderful thing to experience.
And I think this memoir is so timely, because I don't think we're taught how to grieve in this society. Especially as children, we're just kind of taught to squash it all down inside us.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I've been very fascinated, obviously, with the idea of it since I was a child, and because I suffered that loss. But it has definitely changed my relationship to living. And I think that it can either make you very afraid or it can make you the opposite. And at different periods of one's life, you have different tools that you can rely on to sort of cope with those sorts of things. For me, I'm a writer. One of my tools was writing, and it was reading and making sense of that. But I think everyone has the ability to call upon their tools, whatever that is. For some, it may be speaking with someone. For some, it may be singing. It may be creating other forms of art, or it may be just learning to cultivate a spiritual practice, and whatever that means for someone. But it definitely brings you close to that otherworldly, unknown, mysterious thing that we call death. And I have, now that I'm the age that I am, and having gone through this experience in this project, I have a very interesting relationship to it now. I don't. I think it can be a very sacred process, and you're absolutely correct. We don't apply enough attention to it, even though it's just this inextricable thing that we're all going to have to experience. For me, I'd rather have a good experience, and welcome it as much as that is even humanly possible, right? But that's what it taught me. The reading of what everyone else says about it, and certainly those who have experienced it or have had the time to contemplate it, have some really wonderful things to say about it. A lot of the wisdom traditions have some really beautiful things to say about that process.
Did you always keep a journal? Did you write your thoughts down as a young person?
I wouldn't call it a strict journal. I do in the book call it list making. So when my sister died, I did a lot of list making, and I still do it to this day. I just love lists. And it could be anything from grocery lists to what I want to accomplish in the next 3 years kinds of lists. But that was my way of structuring my thoughts. And so I wouldn't call it journaling so much. And it wasn't until the beginning of this book that I would say I was journaling, but I was not regular. I didn't do it every day. I certainly didn't have a practice around doing it every morning or every evening. But I was always writing. So whenever I had time not to be writing, I would do something else, right? I would read a lot, or I was also making films at the time, and I would do that. So yeah, I think, as a practice, I love the process of that. But I was never particularly good at staying regular on it.
Well, I'm definitely a list maker myself, and I think that shows that we need some type of control over our daily task, over something in our life that we can check off or not check off. It's under our own control.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's so gratifying. I will write down things in a list that I've already done so that I can cross them off. Right? You know what I mean? It already gives me a sense of accomplishment.
I'm going to steal that from you. I'm going to try that myself.
Oh, I already did these 3 things. I'm going to put at the top of the list.
I feel so much more accomplished now.
Yes, exactly.
Once you wrote this book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
All those things went through my mind. By the time that I got very earnest about completing it and just being done with the story, with the narrative, and there's probably lots of deeper reasons why I didn't rush to do that. But I got some traction. I sent my manuscript to a few literary agents who called for it. I queried. I did all of those things. I have a lot of author friends, so I also had a lot of people who gave me some great advice. The decision to go with a small press happened really organically. And I'd had a friend who had published in the same press. I did the research. I had already read books that this press had published. So I knew I would be in good company. And I also knew that it was kind of a gift because it happened with very little effort. And I always see that as a gift horse. I didn't spend a lot of time clamoring after somebody in particular or trying to get it, or waiting the amount of time it would take to get it published in a big house. So I went with a smaller press. And it's been a tremendous experience working with Jackleg because it's a lot of book lovers and really dedicated people who just love literature. So yeah, that's kind of how it happened. And I still queried. I sent the manuscript. They accepted it and they were just very excited, to have it. Right. It was a smaller pool, and it was just nicer to be in a smaller pool of people and to get that kind of attention. And then, so in the process did not take very long. It took about probably 9 months. I was supposed to be published in the spring of 2023, but my book was already done and it required very little editorial work. So I was really hoping to get it out sooner. And it just so happened that someone else's book took longer, so they slotted mine in and we were able to get it out this fall.
Because you're a filmmaker, do you write as if you can see it on the big screen? Do you write in scenes? How do you handle that?
That's a great question. I was always a writer. I was a writer even before I went to film school. So I would say that my writing is highly visual. I'm a visual learner too. So my writing is highly visual in general. And then what film school gave me was the gift of dialogue, right? Like, how do you write something and set a scene and create dialogue? But I was also very enamored by documentary filmmaking in particular. So writing about real or being able to craft stories where real people are speaking for themselves was always my favorite exercise in that. But I did write some scripts. I wrote some pilots, and all of that came really easy to me. I think that writing the book, it functions like vignettes, really. So it functions like very small, visceral, vignette-ish style chapters, right? The chapters are very short. And I also pull in different forms, which is a very visual thing to do, right? So sometimes there's poetry, sometimes there's dialogue, sometimes there is excerpts and other people, writing about other things. So I would say that it's heavily influenced, but it would be very easy for me, for example, to see the book as something on screen, right? And so I think people could probably visualize that for sure.
Well, that's how I write. I wrote my first book about 3 young pregnant women in New Orleans back in the 60s. So I could see those pregnant women on the streets of New Orleans, and I could see what they were dressed in the 60s. I could see what they ate, where they walked. And so I see everything very visually like you do.
Yep, absolutely. I love it. I think most people are visual learners. I think everyone sort of, that's the wonderful thing about having a book where you can visualize it exactly for yourself. Even if it's being described to you, you just have more freedom.
Well, it's interesting to me that you write for Apple. I would love to know what writing for Apple really means. What's your routine every day?
I function like a journalist, to be honest. I work for a fantastic team. We're a pretty small team, but I basically run a news desk in Apple that's internally focused, and it's really about the success of how Apple products are changing things in technology and in the world, and what the impact that they're making, right? And Apple's, of course, very famous, very marketing driven organization, and I work for the enterprise side. So enterprise is, how are we going to get more of these amazing products into businesses and enterprise, right? So generally, Apple, which is a very consumer oriented company and has a very, very heavy marketing influence. Well, the same is true for business, right? But you just have to tell a different story. So my job is to tell stories that will help, the enablement, whether it's government or education or business, realize the value of impact. And this is very easy for me because I've been an Apple user since college, right? So for me, it was very innate. I was obviously a very big loyal fan.
And as all of us are.
Yes, exactly. So it's just the ease of it, and the impact that it can have is just extraordinary. So I get to learn a lot about how United Airlines is using it, how government and institutions and educational institutions are using the products. So it's really nice, and it's there's a lot of customer success stories weaved into that, but predominantly I write news articles and announcements that help spread the word.
Has your day job influenced how you have or will create publicity for your book?
Well, I would recommend to anyone who's with a small press or not in one of the big houses that doesn't have a publicity machine, to hire a publicist, at least for a short period of time. I knew from the beginning that I would not have any time. And so the best thing I ever did was to hire Laura Marie PR, and she actually works very closely with Jackleg Press. She's been phenomenal. She's been terrific, and my stuff is getting out there. I made Shondaland's Best of November list. I made Miss Magazine's Best of November list. So these really wonderful things that I wasn't expecting, in a very short amount of time, came to be because of her, not because I'm particularly good at social and it's funny because I do it for my job, but it's not something that I personally am very engaged with. But I had to sort of, get that going, stand up a little website, figure that stuff out for myself.
Well, I think that's true of a lot of us. I was in publicity and marketing for my career, but when you turn around and try to promote yourself, it's a different ball game.
It's such a different ball game. I don't prefer it. I don't like it. Which is nice because I can come on this show with you and have a wonderful conversation. And like, I enjoy that part. That's nice to spend my time. But yeah, the rest is hard.
I know. Well, tell us a little bit more about the book and then read from it so that we can hear your tone and voice.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, this book is a memoir, and it's very contemplative. It can be a little bit sad, also funny, and also I think in a particular way quite universal. I don't think there's anyone on the planet who hasn't experienced grief of some sort. So whether you've lost someone or not, the feeling of it is universal in every culture. And everyone has different rituals, or families have different ways of dealing with that sort of thing. So, the like I had mentioned before, I think the unique thing about this is how you articulate the grief of a child. How does that look and feel like and sound like, while still maintaining, an intelligent, sort of insightful approach to what that might feel like, right? So it was really about tapping into that. I think that makes it a little bit unique, but it's non-chronological, so it doesn't give people the luxury of starting from the beginning and moving in this sort of chronological arc. However, there is an arc, and the very beginning of the book relies heavily on those childhood anecdotes, and then by the end of the book, someone else has emerged, the adult who thinks of things differently, and looks back on that. So there is it's heavily more influenced by the present moment. And so there is an arc there, but it is, it's a nice little ride. You go in and out of different time zones. And just so you know, and the readers know, I do have at the very beginning of each chapter a small prelude by another author. So it's something that they've said, something that I've quoted, and that sets up the theme of that chapter in some way or another. So this is chapter 1. And left behind and drenched as the grass with drops of dew. Kobayashi Isa. In the middle of what looks like a field, right next to Interstate 280 South in northern Ohio, is a grave. It's a new cemetery with few trees and fewer graves. On the ground is a rectangular granite stone that reads Virginia Marie Garza, born October 31st, 1968, died May 19th, 1978. My 9-year-old sister and cousin were put in the ground forever. I was 10, and not having any idea how long forever was, I was constantly surprised. And still, I am surprised. I don't know what to call this story. For 3 weeks and 2 days after my sister's death, I am terrified of dying. I am terrified that I or my parents or my grandparents or the dog across the street will die. Having decided I was barely surviving, I decided I was a Jew and hiding in Ohio. When I suggested this to my mother, she gently asked me how I could manage to be a Catholic and a Jew at the same time. I reminded her that the early Christians were Jews and so was Jesus Christ. Yes, that's true, she says, while stopping me from pulling a loose thread from her brown and orange flowered bedspread. I tell my mother all about Anne Frank and remind her that some people can be hiding for years when everyone thinks they are dead, but they are not. They're just hiding. My mother reminds me that my sister is not hiding. Saying, "I know she's dead, Mom," does not prevent me from thinking that my sister is just hiding and bound to show up at any moment, and I should therefore be prepared. Thus began my love of lists. As long as I could list my thoughts, I felt a degree of control over them, as if by listing them I was slapping my thoughts into submission. My most important list was a series of questions I would ask my sister upon her return home. Question number 1. What is the color blue? Question number 2. Is it true for sure that my dreams are not real? Question number 3. If yes to number 2, then why do we dream? Question number 4. Can you read my thoughts? Question number 5. If yes to number 4, then what exactly are thoughts? Question number 6. Where did you go? Question number 7. Is there really a God? Question number 8. If yes to number 7, then what is God really like? Question number 9. Did God tell you that I told him to tell you that I love you? Question number 10. Do you have superhuman powers since you took your trip? Question number 11. If yes to number 10, then make a list and teach me your powers. If no, then what is the point of meeting God? The relief I feel from performing such an exercise is so profound that it consistently overshadows the knowledge that she is not coming back. Rather than adding to my list, I am always changing it. I always choose 11 items, one number shy of my favorite number. There was some logic to this, but I can't remember what it was. Maybe it's the same logic my cousin Rachel, whose pajama party my sister and cousin never arrived at, used when she decided to skip her birthday in 1978. We found out a year later when Rachel announced to everyone's surprise that she was a year younger than she actually was. She said, matter-of-factly, I skipped that year. I skipped weeks and months after Gina's death. I just wiped them off the map of time. And then I took to daydreaming without realizing it, skipping time altogether. Anything could set me off. I could fall into a trance while looking at a beetle behind the garage. When I finally hear my mother calling me, I had no way of explaining to her what I was doing. I couldn't say I was looking at a beetle because that would sound stupid. So I yelled back, nothing, which my mother, like all mothers, took to mean I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing. Death does that to time, compresses it, slows it down until time ceases to exist. A year feels like a week, 3 years like 3 weeks. Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan says that death lives behind you to your left, and arms stretch away, ready to tap you on the shoulder. Lorca calls it duende, death as friend, death as companion. But then there is my other feeling. At the funeral, I walk into the field adjacent to the parking lot. I close my eyes, and the blazing sun behind my eyeballs lifts me out of the parking lot and into Pearson Park. From there, I can see Pickle Road, the truck, the field, and my sister. But instead of her lying there dead, she sits lotus-style eating an orange. It came to be that I could see anything I wanted by closing my eyelids. The point wasn't to not use the eyes. The point was to close the eyelids. The day I flew from the parking lot to the field at Pickle Road was the day I was introduced to my other feeling, Grace. Grace is Aretha Franklin. She wears a white gown with diamonds for eyes and snow-white hair. She is magic. She is the sun, the fresh-cut grass, and the smell of dirt. She is the smile on my face and the calmness in my heart, and all of this on what turned out to be still the worst day of my life. Grace resides to my right, and she is louder and far more beautiful and more powerful than death, and therefore capable of coaxing death to do whatever she wants. She is powerful enough to make death shut up. Death would whisper, certainly, if it can happen to you, it can happen to anyone. Or worse yet, it can happen to you again. But then Grace would whisper, yes, my girl, it is not only true, but it is the truth. So why worry about it? So instead, 3 weeks and 2 days after my sister's death, I decide I want to die. I imagine my death in hundreds of ways. I die riding my bike, smashed to a pulp by a reckless teenager who only has his driver's permit. I die drowning in dirty Lake Erie after jumping off the jetty. I freeze to death outside my bedroom window from eating too much snow. I get struck by lightning. I die when I fall out of a tree and crack my head open, and instead of blood pouring out, there are just dead thoughts that trickle out and collect in a puddle, which I then stomp on and watch scatter in the wind. However, thinking I finally understand what an attack of the heart means, I decide to die of a heart attack. Except in the case of my heart, I decide it will not give me any warnings. It will just beat slower and slower until it stops, like melting an ice cube under my armpit in the middle of summer. Slowly or quickly, my heart starts shrinking until I see it's the size of a pinhead beating tiny beats, like a lighthouse beam, flowing through my bloodstream, working its way out of me, through my eyeball, and then flying away. My heart waves to myself, dead, down there in the yard.
Oh, Victoria, those descriptions, and they're so beautifully poignant. And you had us right inside that little girl. I was 10 years old myself again.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very sweet. Very kind.
Now, are you writing anything else?
I am, yes. A couple different things. We'll see which one kind of bubbles to the surface. One is more an inspiration for my kids. But the other one is still a nonfiction. I would definitely say I have found my form. My form is creative nonfiction. And it probably, there's just some incredibly tragic and interesting and beautiful stories on my father's side that I would like to examine, particularly back when, he was recovering, and this was in Texas. It was actually a small town in Texas. So it would be that sort of thematic thing. But yeah, I'm just sort of letting things bubble up.
Is that your favorite genre to read, is nonfiction?
Creative nonfiction. So I do love memoir. I do love things that bend the fictional and nonfiction worlds together. I do love that sort of, I do love fiction too, as well. I do love honestly, I love it all. I'm not someone who's going to probably read a nonfiction book on a particular topic, although I've read some of those, but I do love the lyricism and the poeticism of literary nonfiction, for sure.
Does your family support your career as a writer? Sometimes when we write memoir, it can be a touchy subject for families.
I've had nothing but support from my family. They're pretty incredible. I think the book does touch upon some very personal things in some of their lives, and particularly a couple of my aunts and what was happening in their life at the time of the accident, which I didn't expect them to expose, but they're not secretive people. And so it just did not occur to them to like hold back. If you asked a question, they would simply answer it. And so I have a couple of really wonderful passages that are about the dynamic and the politics happening in the family at the time. But I've received nothing but just delight and warmth, and a really phenomenal response. And they're all getting their books now, right? Because they ordered them in advance, and they're taking pictures of them and sending them to me. So they're all very, very proud.
Oh, that's so wonderful to have a family that's so open and honest. Where I grew up in the South, there were lots of family secrets and nobody discussed them.
And that's where all the juicy, amazing stories are, right? You can't not be honest and expect to get something interesting. But yeah, I think that people I think that, generally, unless you're a writer or you grew up as a writer, you think that your life isn't interesting. But in fact, everyone's life is interesting, and you could write anything beautiful about any particular topic. And I think everybody has a life that is interesting enough for them to write a book about, right? It's just whether or not they are compelled and have the skill or the desire to do it, because it does take a lot of effort, for sure.
That's so true. We all have a story in us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, Victoria, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are a unique set. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
Well, my number one advice would be, if you've ever wanted to, or it's something that you've been thinking of, there's absolutely no time at the present to do it. And there's tons of people who've been doing it enough that you can find out how it's best for you personally to do it. There is self-publishing, there is small presses, there are contests, there's ways of, getting a story out there. I'm a huge advocate for just ordinary people writing down their stories, in any way that you can. Even writers, like I've had friends who are not writers per se, but they could dictate their stories. We have the kind of technology now that you don't need to sit there and write it if you don't want to. You could dictate it, get it translated, and see, how it looks on the page. So yeah, my number one piece of advice is to just to finish it and complete it. 50 is young. There's a lot of time to enjoy the fruits of that labor. And I would, do it.
I agree. And I think recording our family members is so important, because, we lose their voice so quickly after they're gone, and we can't hear it in our heads. And so I think, if anybody can record their family members to listen to later, it's
Yeah,
such a special thing to do.
it absolutely is. And people think of that doing that in terms of video. One of my favorite authors is Studs Terkel, and he's really famous for being able to create characterizations of real people.
Yeah.
And the amount of specificity in a real person, there are things that you simply can't dream up. So if you're a writer, you can dream it up because but you're still observing, right? You're just a master observer of real people. And that was my way of sort of paying homage to that style of writing where you try and capture someone's essence. And I did that with a handful of family members. But I would absolutely, I would love that. I would love reading those sorts of things.
Well, I think you are leading such an interesting life, and I just appreciate your being here to share it with us today. And we're excited to say that you're now one of our authors over 50.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend, and check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's D-A-I-L-Y, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing, and remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.